We have a fantastic 1 hour coming up now about one of the most important questions that we face as a species, which is, what is us? What are we, and what can we become? I want to perhaps ask a couple of questions before I introduce our first speaker and before we get onto the panel. So just in the abstract, I suppose, some of you may be parents, some may be grandparents, some may not have kids yet, but in the abstract, if you could make selections about your next generation, say perhaps to prevent a significant health condition, just as a show of hands, how many people would do that? Okay, a fair number. Let's get them back down again. And what about the second question, which is if you could choose to enhance them in some way, give them super strength or super cognition, how many people would go ahead and do that? Okay, still a number, brave number, slightly smaller. We're going to explore these issues and more. We're going to start with our first speaker and then go into a panel discussion. So I'm very excited to invite Stephen Hsu, who is the Vice President of Research at Michigan State University and the founder of Genomic Prediction. Stephen, wonderful to have you. You dressed up today.
Yes,
this is
I
as
did.
formal as I've seen you in all the times we've met.
This is my uniform as a theoretical physicist.
Amazing. Well, apart from being a theoretical physicist, you're going to talk to us about genetics.
Thank you.
I don't think you need that.
I just
You
have
one of
this.
those. You got one of those.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you may remember from university, professors love to profess. But Azeem has asked me to keep my part of the presentation down to 20 minutes, so I'm going to try to go through these slides expeditiously. And he also asked me to start at the very beginning with the basics. Excuse me if I'm blocking anybody's view of the screen. So let's start by talking about our DNA, the information that is in every cell of the body and which builds us from a single cell to this huge organism that we become in adulthood. Now, your DNA consists of about 3 billion base pairs. And to read out that entire set of information costs now only about $1,000. Now, humans are very similar to each other. So if you take a chunk of my DNA and you compare it with the corresponding chunk of your DNA, we will only differ at about 1 in 1,000 places. So we're 99.9% similar. And so that means out of the 3 billion total base pairs, there are typically a few million separating any two individuals. But it's those few million differences that on the one hand give you LeBron James, on the other hand they give you me, and on the other hand they may give you Shakespeare. That's all somehow encoded in those few million typical differences. And in fact, we know more than that. We know that there are specific locations in the genome where two people are more likely to differ from each other. So the variation is quite common. And we now have very inexpensive technology for measuring those million or so places where common variation occurs. So that's the most informative part of the genome. And so if you've ever spit in a tube and sent it to 23andMe, they will have measured for you the million or so places where you are most likely to differ from other humans. And that can be done for a very low price now. Because so much data of this type is available, just in the last year or two, the application of AI or machine learning to these large data sets has allowed us to begin to predict complex traits from DNA alone. So complex features of ourselves, our eye color, our height, perhaps our cognitive ability, what disease risks we most will suffer from, those can all now be predicted from DNA alone and even from inexpensive genotypes. A typical data set that's analyzed for this kind of study would be hundreds of thousands of genomes, but perhaps if it's a disease condition, only a few tens of thousands, maybe 30,000 people in that sample will actually have the condition, we'll say have breast cancer, and the rest are what we call controls. We show that data to an AI, and the AI tries to learn from all of those examples. It tries to build an internal model to predict, for example, the risk status for breast cancer. And we've seen huge breakthroughs just in the last year or two in that kind of research. Now, in order to publish a result in this field now, you have to validate out of sample. What that means is that you train on this big training set, but then you show that your predictor works on populations which are born on different continents, have been born in different decades, have experienced different environments than the people that we're trained on. Because of the robustness of those validation tests, we are very confident that what the AIs are picking out are in fact robust genomic predictors for risk or for physical characteristics. What is currently underway is large-scale tests of utility, clinical utility, for screening a population for disease risks using these inexpensive genotypes. That is what is currently ongoing. We can anticipate in just a few years routine clinical application of these breakthroughs. And if there's one thing that you should take away from this talk, it's that the genomic predictors now are good enough that we can reliably identify outliers for risk. So people who are at unusually high risk for a particular disease condition, and even people who are at unusually low risk for a particular disease condition. And I'll give you a bunch of examples in the rest of this talk. Now, I predict that innovative health systems in the US and perhaps here in the UK will start to adopt standard of care inexpensive genotyping. A $50 genetic test is ridiculously cheap compared to the other kinds of tests, medical tests that we undergo. Even a simple blood test to extract your lipid levels costs more than one of these genetic tests. Okay, so here are three examples of genomic predictors. The first one over here is coronary artery disease or heart attack risk. This is type 2 diabetes, and this is breast cancer. In each case, what is plotted on the horizontal axis is the prediction from the algorithm. The algorithm only has access to your DNA. It makes a prediction about what percentile risk you are in the population. Are you a high-risk person or are you a low-risk person? And the vertical axis in all of these plots will be the empirical validation of that prediction. So we look at another population of people and we ask, well, what fraction of those people who are, say, conditional on their being, say, 99th percentile risk, what fraction of them have the disease? So we can now predict lifetime risk of a condition like breast cancer based on your inexpensive genotype alone. And the point I was trying to make earlier, which is that we can identify outliers. In each case, the outliers I'm talking about are the people who are out here, and they could easily be at 10 times higher risk than a typical person in the population. The question is, this has never been possible before in medical science. The question is, how do we adapt to this new world? Okay, here's another type of genomic prediction. This is a result from my lab. This is a predictor for height. We analyzed almost 500,000 people, and the AI produced a predictor which has accuracy of about 1 inch. These blue dots are men, red dots are women. This is the prediction of height in centimeters. This is the actual height on the vertical axis. And the error bar here computed for each bin of individuals, this error bar has standard error of about 1 inch. So if you go to a crime scene and the police get some DNA from the gun, they'll be able to tell you that the person who shot this gun was between 6'1" and 6'3". Okay? That has never been possible before. When you look inside the complex genetic architecture of a trait like height, if you think about what determines your height in life, did you drink enough milk growing up? What was your hormone balance? Did you get enough exercise? Did you sleep enough? How does the bone and how does the calcium deposition work in your bones? All of those things are under genetic control, and so we expect a very complex genetic architecture. What is plotted here is, imagine that I laid out your 23 chromosomes end to end, and so the coordinate on this axis goes from 0 to about 3 billion. And if one of the particular polymorphisms in your genome is affecting height, this black line will go up if the rare variant makes you taller. The black line will go down if the rare variant makes you shorter. And by combining all of these 20,000, 25,000 different pieces of information, we're able to make that prediction. So this is the first time a complex human trait, which is quantitative, which can be measured by a number, has been predicted directly from DNA. And again, once the training occurs, we trained on about 500,000 people, the validation happens on people who have been born and raised in different decades on different continents. So the predictor is quite robust. It works in different populations. Okay? Here's a list from a recent paper of ours of a bunch of different disease conditions for which we can do genomic prediction. And this is an example for atrial fibrillation. So again, your risk percentile is on the horizontal axis. The actual risk in a validation population is shown on the vertical axis. And you can see this characteristic nonlinear behavior, where as you get into the tail, you get increasingly high risk. This is something called atrial fibrillation, which is an irregular behavior of your heart. Now, what's interesting for people who know a little bit of mathematics, this red line is a theoretical curve. Once we characterize the properties of the predictor, we can make theoretical predictions for how the percentile in the population will correspond with actual risk. And these black dots with error bars are actually an experimental confirmation that that equation, which I could write on a single line, is actually correctly predicting your risk given your DNA. Okay, so currently, if one wanted to, one could deliver genomic risk reports covering about 20 common disease conditions to a clinical healthcare, to a healthcare system. And what you then want to think about is what to do with outliers that you can predict are at high risk for that condition. Some of the things you might do involve lifestyle intervention. So if somebody's at high risk for type 2 diabetes, you might ask them to exercise more, maybe reduce their body weight. For certain conditions, there are very well justified interventions that one might make. So for example, in the case of breast cancer, because we already know of certain rare variants, the so-called BRCA variants, which predispose some small fraction of the population for breast cancer, those women are already treated differently. They are given mammograms starting about 10 years earlier than women who are not at high risk. What has changed now is that we have a predictor which is based on roughly about 1,000 different locations in your genome, which predicts risk which could be even higher than what women who have the BRCA variation have. But these are examples of ways in which one could change medical care based on the introduction of these risk predictors. Okay. I don't have time to go through this slide, but if you do a cost-benefit calculation, so in the United States, you can't convince insurance companies to do anything in the medical system unless it actually saves them money. Okay? Arguing that you could save lives is secondary to them. You have to argue that it saves money. If you do a very simple calculation, you say, let's suppose we genotype all the women in the population, and we just calculate the benefit, the money that we save from detecting a certain fraction of breast cancer cases early, you can show that order of magnitude, these are already in the right ballpark. You could pay for the genotyping cost per individual by just the money that you save for breast cancer. But in fact, of course, you don't just save money in breast cancer, you save money in all of the different disease conditions where you can do something. Okay. Here in the UK, the NHS has already stated that they're going to offer out-of-pocket genotyping. So if you are willing to pay for the genotyping, they will genotype you through an NHS pipeline, and that data, I don't know how they're going to make it available to physicians, but I think it will eventually be made available to your physician. Your health minister described his own polygenic risk scores in a speech he gave to the Royal Society back in March. And so perhaps the NHS will beat even the more innovative US healthcare systems in making this standard of care. Okay. Let me switch gears and talk about another application of these genetic predictors. Does anybody know what these are? This guy knows. So these are human embryos. As many of you may know, in vitro fertilization is now very common. In many European countries, typically about 5% of all children born are born through in vitro fertilization. I believe in Denmark, the number is close to 10%. Now, in vitro fertilization, what happens is that the standard of care now is that you let the embryo grow to roughly about 100 cells. When the embryo is at about 100 cells, you could take, if you chose, a biopsy of a few cells from the placental region and do genetic testing or genetic screening of that embryo. Embryos are routinely frozen now. That gives the mother's body some time to recover after the egg extraction. And so that gives plenty of time to do genetic screening or genotyping of that biopsy sample, and then it allows the parents to make decisions based on what information can be derived from that genotype. So worldwide, roughly 1 million embryos are genetically tested worldwide. So if you aggregate over the whole world, it's roughly about 1 million embryos that are subject to some kind of genetic screening today. But most of that screening today is just looking for some kind of abnormality in their chromosome count. So it's a very simple kind of crude genetic testing. What we've done at our company, Genomic Prediction, is we've built a pipeline which takes the standard biopsy sample, so requires no modification of behavior on the part of the clinic. It tests for aneuploidy. It tests for hundreds of the most common disease-related Mendelian mutations. So those would be things like cystic fibrosis or Tay-Sachs or BRCA. But then also, it generates a sufficiently deep genotyping that we can actually compute polygenic risk scores for all of those 20 or so different common diseases for each embryo. And one of the innovative things that we do is that because we only get a little bit of DNA, because we're only taking a few cells off of the embryo, the genotyping is a bit noisy. We error correct the genotype that comes from genotyping of the cells by using what are called haploblocks of the parents. The DNA of the child looks like a kind of mishmash amalgam of the parental DNA, but it happens in blocks. And so if we have both parents' genotype, we can error correct the DNA of the embryo. So we get a very accurate genotype of the embryo. Our embryo genotype is actually more accurate than the 23andMe genotype that you get back. And the cost of this is about $2 or $3,000 per IVF cycle, so it's similar to the cost for existing aneuploidy testing. Okay. This is a list of different conditions that are already in our pipeline. For example, type 2 diabetes is one of those. This is a feature that might appear in your risk report. Each of these little blocks here is one of your chromosomes, and if there's some abnormality found, it would be indicated. Okay. This process can be done if an IVF clinic has its own genetic testing lab. Then there's a kitified form that we can send to them, or we can accept the biopsy sample from anywhere in the world in our laboratory in the United States. Okay. Let me say a little bit about how this all works, since this is an AI festival. The key variable, if you want to solve a particular heritable trait, so you want to build a predictor which captures most of the heritable variants of that trait, the key variable is the sparsity. So what is the genetic architecture of that trait? The simplest traits maybe only depend on a few dozen different locations in your genome. The most complicated, like height, which I showed you, could depend on something like 30,000 locations. So far, we've not found any trait which is more complicated than that. Now, even a number like 30,000 is a small fraction of the million candidate features that the AI is looking at. So for those of you who know a little bit about machine learning, this is a sparse learning problem. You need to bias the algorithm towards sparsity, because the ultimate predictor it's going to build is not going to need to activate most of the features. It's only going to use a small fraction of the features. And in the last 10 years or so, there's been a huge amount of research done even by pure mathematicians on this subject of sparse learning, and it's to the point where we actually have performance guarantees. We can estimate how much data is actually required to solve a particular genetic trait. We expect dramatic improvement of the qualities of these predictors, and the basic reason is that still the amount of training data is limited. So the number of cases where you're actually getting the information about the disease is still typically only in the 10,000 to 100,000 range, even though we might have many hundreds of thousands of controls to use in the training. So this number is increasing rapidly, and so we expect very fast improvement of these predictors in the coming years. Okay. Let me close with some comments about the controversial phenotype that everyone always wants to focus on. So this is actual data. This is 100,000 ninth graders in the United States who are tested for mathematical, verbal, and spatial ability. You'll note that they don't fill out this cube uniformly. They actually populate an ellipsoid. The major axis of this ellipsoid is something called the principal component, or G, for cognitive ability. And what's colloquially called IQ is to get what is colloquially called the IQ of a person, you project them onto this major axis, and then the coordinate along this major axis is their IQ. Okay? And the current best predictors that we have for IQ correlate about 0.3 or 0.4 with the actual IQ score. And for reference, if you're not familiar with correlation as a mathematical function, that is similar to the ability of the SAT, which is a test that graduating high school students take in the United States. That is similar to the ability of the SAT to predict how well you do in college. So it's noisy prediction, imperfect prediction, but still non-trivial. Our theoretical results predict that once we get to about 1 million individuals with good cognitive scores, we would be able to raise this correlation to about 0.7. Okay? This is how much time do I have left? 1 minute. Okay. This is out of sample validation of predictors. So these are about 20,000 people in total, some in New Zealand, some 60, 70, 80-year-old people in the United States, some 40, 50-year-old people in the United States. We have information about their family background. Did they come from a wealthy, highly educated family, a poor, less well-educated family, a middle-class family? And the genomic predictor can predict social mobility within class. It can also predict social mobility between brothers in a family. Okay, so it's a validation test of the predictor. You go to an existing longitudinal study where there are individuals whose lives have been tracked, who have been genotyped, and you ask, can the predictor predict what happens to these people in their lives? And the answer is yes. Okay? This is a very recent paper which tracks, I think, several thousand American kids through their high school math curriculum. Kids with indicated in blue are a high polygenic score for cognitive ability, low polygenic score for cognitive ability. You can see the blue track goes through calculus, maybe terminal degrees of master's plus, low polygenic score, less math, perhaps no high school degree. Okay, again, this is out of sample validation of an AI-trained predictor. And my last slide. These are chickens. The chickens you ate today were like this. This was a leading agricultural breed in the 50s, in the 70s. Today, chickens today and cows are bred using SNP-based prediction. The same kind of mathematics that I'm describing here is already used to breed agricultural animals. These chickens were fed in exactly the same way, and they were the same age when this picture was taken. This is the Shaquille O'Neal of chickens, and probably if you went to a farm with 100,000 chickens in 1957, you would not find a single Shaquille O'Neal-like chicken in that population. So what this is showing you is the potential that is in your genome. What can actually happen if someone takes systematic steps to improve your genetics? Let me stop there.
Incredible. Why don't you take a seat? Great. Okay, some very hard questions for us to explore over the next 35 minutes or so. So I'm going to start by asking my panelists to come up. First of all, Dr. Helen O'Neill, who is the Director of Reproductive Science and Women's Health at UCL and also the CEO of Fertility Health. Lovely to have you. And I think you've got some hands-on experience. Many congratulations. And then my very good friend, Martin Varsavsky, one of Europe's top technology entrepreneurs. Thank you, Martin. Good to see you. I'm glad you're here. Please, take a seat. So I'm sure I didn't do a great job of the introductions. Maybe, Helen, could you just give us a sentence on what you do at UCL and Fertility Health as well? And then, Martin, after you could perhaps do an introduction.
I am a molecular geneticist and a lecturer in reproductive and molecular genetics. And so my research group focuses on using genome editing, or CRISPR, in very early embryos, like the pictures that you saw a little bit earlier than that, to see if we can modulate the genes in those embryos to make corrections of mutations. And my work that incorporates machine learning is looking at ways that we can cleverly look at 10,000 papers instead of one faulted human being reading one paper and trying to devise the best possible method for making a faithful, replicable edit in an embryo that's safe.
Thank you. And Martin, please introduce yourself.
Well, I guess I'm the failed scientist in this panel. I only made it to pre-med, and then I became professor of entrepreneurship, which doesn't count. But I have built the largest chain of fertility clinics in the US, and we're building with a group of scientists at Cambridge and in Spain a machine that makes human embryos. So I approached the same field more from the entrepreneurship side.
Thank you very much. So let's start with some ground zero questions to build our knowledge up. And perhaps, Helen, would you level us up on what IVF is, what it means in the UK, and how and why people access it?
So IVF, or in vitro fertilization, is essentially the method with which two people can have a baby if they are struggling with infertility. And infertility is on the rise. There are some, you gave a statistic with the numbers, but I think that number is rapidly growing by the year because I think probably before infertility was a medical diagnosis for something, and now a lot of infertility, or the majority of infertility, is actually lifestyle related. And I always say that the most damaging thing to your fertility is hope, because a lot of young people hope that they're going to meet this person, and they presume that it's going to happen when they're this age, they'll get married at another age, and then they will be able to have said 2.5 children and a dog. And unfortunately, or fortunately, our lives are very different from that now. We are not our mother's daughters, or we are, but our lives are very different. So we are putting this process off because we have jobs, because we have companies, because we have commitments, and because we have fun. And unfortunately, Mother Nature has not kept up with this trend. So it allows us the ability to, I guess, circumvent this problem, where you would take multiple eggs from a female and sperm from a male. The process is a lot more friendly in the male category. I think they enjoy it, but it's a terrible process for women, so by no means is this an easy or easy process. And we will fertilize them in the lab, and then we wait for them to grow, and if they are healthy looking, we will transfer them back to the woman. This was not created in the lab. This is an experiment, but not of my own.
Wonderful. And Martin, you entered this market in the US a few years ago. What did you make of the market, and how did you seek to change it, and what came next?
Well, I actually agree with this. It's a lifestyle decision. People's baby boomers had their biology and their psychology kind of working together, and that's where they're called baby boomers. And now we have the lowest fertility rates in developed countries we've ever had, and that's because the biology and the psychology of people just went different ways. And what we do is we bridge the biology and the psychology by certain techniques. We haven't yet spoken about egg freezing. We're the largest providers of egg freezing services in the United States. We have clinics in New York and the Bay Area that are now doing as many or close to as many IVF cycles as egg freezing cycles. An egg freezing cycle is the obtention of oocytes from a woman through a period of 2 weeks in which they take gonadotropins, and then they have something called an egg retrieval under mild sedation. The eggs are stored in liquid nitrogen under -190 for as many years as the women want, except that in this country, I think there's a weird law that they say that after 10 years, you have to use them before 10 years, which I hope you all lobby to change. We don't have IVF clinics in this country. But after that, it's like an IVF. So egg freezing is like an IVF extended over a decade. Let's say at the end of this decade, you get sperm, you mix it with eggs, and you end up finishing the IVF. So egg freezing is like an IVF broken in time.
Right, and it's becoming sort of a popular perk in some well-heeled companies, Goldman Sachs, Facebook, and
many of our
so
patients come from companies that pay for egg freezing. They also pay, by the way, for kindergarten or child benefits. I know there's been a backlash in Europe where they feel these women are trying to get a message, like don't have babies while you work here. But these companies also help you when you have babies. And I think they're doing a wonderful thing, giving women choice. And that's what we do. We give women and men choice to have babies later in life. We also do a lot of egg donations where the age limit is 55, and it's easier for us to get a 50-year-old woman pregnant with donated eggs than a 40-year-old pregnant with her own eggs.
Right. Right, so we've leveled up on some of the technologies, which I think is important. Steve, tell us about what you learn from your parents or would-be parents when they're given the choice of the genomic screen. What are they looking out for?
Well, as you can imagine, we get inquiries by email in large numbers from parents. When they hear about what we can do, they want to participate. Most parents just want to have a healthy child. They want to reduce the risk of some really serious medical condition. However, there are parents who want to do things like make sure that their child is brilliant, or maybe they're particularly concerned that the child won't be brilliant. We, for example, don't do cosmetic features. I didn't mention anything about cosmetic features, but things like eye color, hair color, male pattern baldness, these are all predictable as well, but we don't actually offer that.
Helen, you've worked and studied with many parents going through the IVF process. What do you hear from them about their concerns? How do they approach the process?
I really think it depends on what brings them there. If these are parents who don't suffer from infertility but know that they are carriers of a genetic disorder, they are there for genetic screening of their embryos or genetic diagnosis of their embryos. They are happy to have a healthy baby. If they are coming through the IVF process, they have maybe struggled for many years, they are happy with a healthy baby. I think both groups want to have, at the end of the day, a baby to bring home.
I think that it also depends on culture. It's very interesting. I mean, I'm probably the person in this audience who has the most children. I have 7. If anybody has more than 7, please raise your hand. But we can go and have a glass of wine. But I see when my children go from 28 to 2, and all I wanted was a healthy baby, okay? I never wanted to design a smarter, taller baby. Having said this, we have a lot of patients. And our patients come from many cultures. And I would say that there is a different view. You cannot generalize, and I'm sure you could find an American who wants but our Chinese patients are very interested in getting some genetic advantage for their children. And when you speak to the Chinese patients, they say, look, if I'm going to pay for all the Sudoku training and all these things once they're children, why don't I program this Sudoku, right? Or whatever they're going to. And I personally, our job at Prelude is to serve our patients. So we don't pass moral judgments of any kind, and we listen to them. So as part of the things we can do for patients, I think what you were mentioning before is useful, but it has to come from the patient.
Yeah. Steve, what's your experience on that? Cultural differences?
Obviously, before we started our company, we did some market research. There are academic surveys in East and South Asia and Southeast Asia which show very strong support for pretty aggressive selection in IVF. And as long as it's safe and effective, then families don't think it's unethical or immoral or distasteful to do it. Some of the surveys, 80+% of the parents say they would do it if it were safe and effective. So I am sensitive to the idea that somebody in the UK, say a Guardian writer, science writer, wants to point the finger at me when there are roughly 2 billion people who drastically disagree with her. And I feel it's a kind of Western colonialist kind of view that, well, only our view of the ethics on this particular matter, and these 2 billion brown people, their votes don't count at all.
Helen?
I think we've been doing genetic selection based on traits for centuries, except it was in a far more aggressive and ugly format, and that is through sex selection. Now we have the ability to select the sex of an embryo, and while that is illegal here, it's not illegal in America. It is something that is considered a grave thing to do, and that you would just simply select the sex. And yet for centuries we have carried out, or not me personally, but infanticide has been carried out where we have huge bias in the sex population in many countries, because of this infanticide or selective termination of pregnancy once they realize the sex. So actually, when you go at a much earlier stage and you're looking for, I would say, more trivial traits, then that is a lesser of two evils, really.
A worry I have, a geopolitical worry I have, now that we see that Europeans are mostly against any kind of embryo selection to enhance traits like intelligence, and Asians, many Far East Asians are in favor of these, that we may end up in 50 years or 100 years in a situation where the cognitive abilities of people in the Far East far exceed the cognitive abilities of people in Europe, and you may say, well, so be it. It's about time that the Chinese come up with their own iPhone and we buy it, right? But it's and Huawei doesn't cut it yet. But I think we do have something extremely creative in Europe, and I still have to see the genes for creativity. But having said all this, I think if this becomes mass adoption, if there's a mass adoption of embryo selection through polygenic genetic testing, and if the correlations don't go to 0.3 but 0.7, and if this is done systematically over 50 years, we're going to see a very different evolution of the world.
Well, I spoke with a very senior former NATO general who came out with a line of, now this technology is there, I know my enemy is going to be using it, and it's a slow journey. It's a generation after generation. The man from the MOD at the front is nodding, and it's a slow process, but it is a weapon. Could be a weapon of war. So we're going to come to this, but I want to touch on a social dimension here, which is these technologies are already expensive. I mean, for all the cost of $50 genomic assay, you're looking at $10,000, $15,000 for the number of IVF cycles you'll need in the US, a few £1,000s in the UK. So there is already a question of access. There's also the sense of complexity, because when you get a readout from, even when you get something as cheap as a 23andMe scan, it's more complex to read than a thermometer scan. So how should we be thinking about access? I mean, Helen, again, as the ethicist on the stage, I guess I'm going to turn back to you.
Oh, thank God it's you, not me.
Yeah.
I think that is a major problem we're facing, is access to really fundamental care when it comes to not genomic predictions, your company, but predicting genetics and having this readily accessible genome sequence or parts of your genome that we as normal individuals find it hard to, I guess, process this with relative view and the relative risks that this holds for the rest of our families. Mm-hmm. And the access that we currently have to genetic counselors is very worryingly low. The other problem that we face, not only with genetic counselors, is also what do we do with all of this data when the majority of it we don't yet understand. I think we're rapidly trying to figure out ways to process the data, but we are nowhere near knowing what it is that the majority of our genome does.
Martin, how about you? What have you done?
I wanted to say that there's a problem with patients, not that there's something wrong with patients, but understanding polygenic risk scores, it is very, very difficult for most people in this audience, who many are trained in machine learning and so on. When you have a president that says, the fake media was wrong, it only gave me a 10% chance, and I won, you say, wow, what is his understanding of probabilities? And what is the understanding of probabilities of the average patient? So when you have monogenic illnesses, you say, look, one embryo in four has...
So monogenic illnesses are straightforward. It's one gene. We can knock it out.
Right. One gene. They're not totally straightforward, but they're kind of straightforward, like thalassemia, sickle cell anemia. Monogenic illnesses is kind of easy because the patient says, will my baby have this? And you say no. And that's kind of easy. When you have all these other things that Stephen was describing, or you have these concepts like gene penetrance and like okay, you're going to have this gene, and then 60% of people who have this gene then have this condition, and then these others. Our doctors are avoiding this type of test, partly because, of course, doctor time in America is extremely expensive, but because of the debate. So this was all given to other type of people that are called genetic counselors, and the doctors don't even talk about this anymore, and they send you to a genetic counselor, which then tries to give you the probability and statistics refresher that you need to understand these.
Yeah.
But that's to assume that the doctors in any instance would have known how to explain it in the first place. Most doctors have zero understanding of genetics, and it's something that is putting them at risk too, because they also don't understand the tests that they are now offering.
Steve, you've got some experience of this with genomic prediction.
Well, yes. So obviously most of this technology and science has developed since the MD has been in medical school. So
Yeah.
it certainly wasn't in the curriculum when they were in school. And probably they're not necessarily very mathematical people, so they've forgotten a lot of probability and statistics. So there is this huge need for people like genetic counselors to explain these realities to the general population. And no company can find enough genetic counselors to hire, because it's a very special skill set. You have to be good with people and good with numbers at the same time.
Yeah. Let's get to the other part of the axis, though, which is that we are at the wrong end of 70 years of declining social mobility in the UK and in the US. It's not so true in emerging markets and in Asia, where there's been sort of increasing wealth and mobility. We're doing something different here, where we are starting to tinker with the germline, as it's called. How much of a risk is it that making this technology available to the employees of Goldman and Facebook first embeds those sorts of structural inequalities? Anyone brave enough to take that one first?
I'll tell you, it's kind of like saying that it points towards more inequality, because if only the rich people can afford to do this, and rich people are already rigging the system in many other ways, like helping their kids get into universities with using financial means, and it is. That's why, in that sense, I love the NHS. Frankly, in spite of its problems, I think the NHS is a democratizer of society. I think it may have issues, but I think it's a wonderful system. And when you buy your health with money, the healthier people are wealthier, people are healthy, and then when you buy your genetic throughput with money, then wealthy people will have smarter kids, and that is not a great thing for equality. So I hope if this technology becomes available, it becomes available to all.
Steve?
I agree 100% with Martin. So in the short run, I think we can predict some negative implications for inequality. However, I hope in the long run that society will see that the cost-benefit analysis of this kind of stuff is very positive. So there's no reason for a government not to make it available and free to everyone.
Helen, you're working in the NHS from time to time, I'm guessing?
No.
No. Oh, I'm sorry.
I work in university. It's just as poor.
It's just as poor. But I'm curious about whether you could within a nationalized health system, perhaps use things like this to adjust structural luck, structural position, perhaps say, we're going to help people in sort of poorer cohorts with this technology ahead of others. Is that a practical thought? It's a crazy thought.
I'm not sure it's practical. I'm not sure it's realistic. The strange disparity that we're already seeing is that people of lower socioeconomic group have children and procreate a lot younger. So this demographic of people is increasing far faster than it is the educated, possibly wealthier people, because they're spending their lives in education and in careers. And so this pool of people is actually being diminished. So they have to opt for in vitro fertilization and help, whereas the latter camp do not.
There's an ethical issue which I think hasn't been widely discussed, because up until recently it's been science fiction. Okay, so the idea that if some people have too much wealth, some of it should be redistributed to the people who have less. The question is, if some people have too much in the way of genetic resources or too little in the way of genetic resources, should something be redistributed to them? And I think that's an ethical question societies are going to have to answer, because the tools for redistribution are going to exist in 10 or 20 years.
I think the problem is that it's almost politically incorrect to say that genetics plays a big role in economic success. So if most people do not believe genetics plays a role in economic success, or if you say so, you are getting to a very dangerous political territory. That lack of conversation is going to preserve a system of inequality. We like to believe that all men are created equal and all women and men are created equal. They depends equal for what? And if it's for economic success, it is not clear that all men and women are created equal for economic success. Of course, environment plays a huge role, but there's also a genetic role. And if people, and like I said, at Prelude, we do not offer these services. Patients cannot come and say, I want a smarter child yet. But I think as this happens, parents will want access, some parents will want access, and it will be, we will have to give it to them. We already tell them if they want a boy or a girl. In America, it's legal to say, I want a boy or I want a girl, and they have 3 girls, they want a boy, they have 3 boys, they want a girl, whatever, and we give them gender selection. So if we give them gender selection, obviously we're going to give them all these other things.
Yeah. Well, it seems like there are a lot of complex issues here. Much of the regulation seems to be done by very specialist medical or ethical professionals, but we probably need a wider discourse about this. What do we need to do to make this cultural discourse happen more broadly?
I think that cultural discourse has kind of been brought to the mainstream media with the most recent events that have been happening already, with human embryos being edited and transferred for live births in China, and today's news to say that a second researcher that is in Russia is also planning to do the same. So I think that these...
Could you just say something about that, just again to level us all up? You were actually in Hong Kong when that was announced, I think in November 2018, but it's a different technique and technology to the things we've been describing now. Maybe that would be worth just bringing up.
Absolutely. The difference is in screening an embryo, which is what you are looking at. You're looking at whether something is present or absent, and if it is present and you want it, you will keep it. If it is absent and you don't want it, you will get rid of it. Whereas the technology that I'm talking about, which is CRISPR, genome editing, would look at an embryo, and regardless of whether it was present or absent, you could create the genetic edit in that embryo. And so that is what happened in November in Hong Kong. I was there to speak after the researcher who carried out those experiments about forging a bench to clinical pipeline for human genome editing, and he just forced a clinical pipeline, which was slightly annoying on the grand scheme of the world, feeling the pain, but it was also very annoying from my personal pain from having to rewrite my talk. Regardless, what he had done was edited human embryos, and whereby I can edit an embryo for research practices, he actually transferred them for pregnancies. And so what he wanted to achieve was that these babies would be immune to HIV.
Yeah. And so let's go back to that original question, which is what do we need to do to have the right kind of public open discourse about this?
Sometimes bad things like this forces it into the public eye and forces it into public discourse. So sometimes it takes a rogue to get the conversation going. I think there were ongoing discussions about this regardless, but this certainly forced it into many other...
Steve's going to...
I think any time that you have a big technological breakthrough, you need to have a societal discussion. And if we live in democracies, we need to have a democratic process for dealing with how we want to use these technologies. In this case, though, you may find that even after that process of education and democratic decision-making, some countries are moving in very different trajectories, and I'm afraid that's going to be the case.
No, I think that, we did an internal look in a clinic we have where there were Catholics who live in some neighborhoods, and Jewish people. Jewish people generally are not against the use of IVF, and for the Jewish religion, a baby actually is into the community after a week because so many babies used to die and so on. So Jewish people don't have anti-abortion views and anti-IVF views, and Catholics many times have views against using IVF and using against abortion and against contraceptives. But then when we looked at the neighborhoods where our patients were coming from, we were getting an equal proportion of Catholics and Jews, right? So one thing is what people say, and the other thing is what people do when they have access to a certain technology. I with all respect to the Pope, I think most Catholics use contraceptives, right? And so...
says the man with 7 children.
So, and who doesn't believe in God. But that makes me more unique with the children, because most people have a lot of kids for religious reason, but wasn't my case. But in any case, what I want to say is that this is a complex dialogue, because generally people do not express what they really want to do, but they express what they feel they should say, right? And so if we strongly believe that all people are created equal, and you say, well, but this person will develop this horrible illness and will die at age 4, was not created equal from this person who will probably live a normal life. Well, after maybe 20 years, maybe it's been 15 years of genetic testing of embryos, now people have accepted that. Most people now accept genetic testing for embryos for illnesses. Mm-hmm. Now we have a next wave for traits. I'm personally uncomfortable with that, but I think it's a question of people getting used to these things and see how they react.
Right.
I think context is critical.
So let's think about our political context right now, because we have two guests from the US, and in the US there has certainly been what could only be described as recidivism and retrenchment around how we think about women and their reproductive rights and their reproductive process. And even in the UK, there are hints of it. At least one candidate for the Tory party leadership has got views about rolling back those sort of access to reproductive control. How does our politics and our public debate today allow us to have these conversations about these topics?
I think very often it becomes polarized. And so you have the people who are very for and very against, and the voices in between who are ambivalent or maybe uneducated but would be possibly open to it. They get drowned out. And very often, actually, patient groups have no voice at all, and they would be the loudest and most worthy candidates to have a say in whether or not they would deem the technology, whether they would have been taken the choice to use the technology for their own children.
Right. There are a lot of ethical issues that we confront at the clinic, and we wish there were more guidelines. For example, we have a guideline that we don't give egg donations to women over 55 because we believe 55 is a significant age to be a mom, whatever. But I became, the last time I was a dad, older than 55, and people say, but how can you have a policy like that? You have your kid at 56, whatever. And I wish these guidelines were imposed by someone else. We many times at our clinics have to impose our own guidelines. I wish society had a debate about this and they told us, these are the rules.
We've got time for one last question, so it's always a zinger, the unfair one. It's a very brief answer. Thinking about timelines, how far away are we from trait selection being commonplace in markets? And Steve, you went first. You go first.
2 or 3 years.
Wow, 2 or 3 years. Helen?
In the next 5 years.
In the next 5, Martin?
Yeah, I have to agree.
Wow, we better hurry up and have that conversation. We have had an incredible panel. Helen, I hope if we do this next year, you will bring your +1 with you.
Yes, I will.
Thank you so much, Steve, Helen, Martin.